What is up, guys? So this is going to be a demo of uh, the next section in our value study. And what we're going to learn during this exercise is how to draw highly reflective surfaces. You're going to see a few examples of different objects that may show some highly reflective surfaces. They can vary and they can be different types of objects. It could be something made out of silver or chrome. It could be a bottle of any sort made out of glass, tinted glass. Anything metallic can have a highly reflective surface to it. Also, just to kind of differentiate, there are those that are shiny objects, something as what I'm gonna be doing today is a spoon like this, meaning that's a highly reflective surface, and something that perhaps is a little bit less shiny and less reflective, not so much mirror-like, that perhaps would resemble something like a bottle or a cup. For instance, this is a glass ink bottle, just to show you another example. Obviously, it's still highly reflective, or it has qualities of a high value contrast type object, but it's not as reflective or shiny as perhaps the spoon that I just showed you. All right, so during this exercise, I'm gonna mention about 2 or 3 different points that will be very important for you to learn. So pay attention to this specific distinctions of high value contrast study, high value contrast drawing specifically, and things to pay attention to is how the value structure behaves when we're trying to depict something with a highly reflective surface, specifically pertaining to transition edges. It's a little hint for you, and also related to the different ways that we can still make that object three-dimensional, even though the surface of the object itself may be highly reflective. So before I begin the demo, I want to go through some of the materials that I'm using. We're gonna try to use charcoal for this exercise. Obviously, you're gonna have to do this on your own in light of our lockdown, and use the resources that you have at your disposal, the things that you purchased based on our list of supplies. What we're gonna need for this exercise is charcoal. So I got several different kinds ready. You may have the larger ones that are a little thicker, cubes, and that look more like soft pastel chalks. I got some of the soft ones that we used in class on a previous study, the continuous line and the arbitrary value study. I got some harder ones. They're a little bit broken, but that doesn't matter. So I just got a variety of different charcoals here, and I also have a couple of charcoal pencils that are also various softness. You didn't have that on your list, but for some of you who went ahead and purchased additional supplies, this might come in handy towards the end of this exercise to kind of get some of the details and finer areas accentuated with more smaller, more precise mark making. One of the charcoals that I got is not as soft as this two. It's also one of these guys, and obviously the benefit of having something like that is that you can keep it sharp with a sharpener handy, and as soon as it gets dull, or as soon as you work your way up, you can get yourself a little bit more to work with. Also, the reason I like things like that is that extends my tool, where I can kind of extend the handle, and that way when I'm first brainstorming or warming up, it kind of reduces that sense of control, so I can let the medium sort of guide me freely rather than cling to a sense of control and worry too much about getting it quote unquote right. Another thing that we may use are those paper stubs that some of you have also purchased. One would be fine. I just have a variety just to show you different thicknesses when we start blending, because the nature of charcoal is that it's very dusty and very kind of muddy in type of medium. So there will be a lot of dust and dirt when you're doing this quick study. So beware not to rest the back of your palm on the surface too much, because the potential to smudge your work is extremely high with charcoal. With that said, because charcoal is kind of a softer medium, it also has an opportunity that comes with it, is that it's very malleable, and our ability to correct mistakes also increases. So you can just erase something very easily and redraw it very easily by adding extra pigment on the paper. Speaking of erasing, there will be a lot of reductionist approach to creating highlights and lifting up some of that value, some of that charcoal dust, some of that darker tones off the surface of your work. Regular eraser that you got with the list of supplies, something like that, is going to be definitely useful. I just have a sharper edge, and I always try to keep the edge clean, so rub it off on the edge of the paper. Make sure that that corner is sharp and clean to get more of a finer details, finer highlights towards the end. We're always gonna try to leave the highlights perhaps towards the end. So first we try to build value overall, again going from large to small, from general to specific, as we've always done up to this point, and leave the highlights and some of the finer details towards the end of the process. So an eraser, and your kneaded eraser, this guy right here, the one that can be pulled and cleaned, and the one that can be also shaped into a very fine, sharp point where you really need to get to the areas that are very fine detail areas. All right, and the last thing, obviously this was also an eraser that some of you went ahead and purchased. You don't have to have something like that, but it definitely makes it a lot easier to really get to finer details, and it will just be useful if you're trying to get smaller details highlighted instead of going in with a regular eraser. But again, that's not important, so don't stress about that if you don't have it. And the last thing I wanted to point out is just a pencil. Why would you need a pencil? 6B, 4B, something not, maybe stick to 2B to 4B. You're gonna use it like so when we're just first establishing the form before we go in with our value work. We're just gonna sketch it out within the pictorial space very lightly with a pencil. Mostly just pretty much the outline of whatever object you pick for your study, and maybe kind of outline of some of the shapes within the values. So let's use the spoon as an example. You can see a lot of different highlights and so forth. You can think of different values within this reflective surface as separate shapes. So you're welcome to block them in as just linear drawing at that stage with the pencil, very, very, very lightly. And I will definitely demonstrate that. I do advise you against picking up something as intricate as I did, but I don't unfortunately have any simpler silverware around here. So I have to work with what I have. So work with what you got at home or wherever you are in the dorm. But don't make it more complicated for yourself than necessary. Just try to keep it simple and avoid perhaps things like detail work like that. So the simpler the object, the easier it will be for you to kind of break it down and learn. Well, I'll have to just try to work to the best of my ability and try to get this rendered as much as I can. As always, it's a good idea to start yourself with a few quick warm-ups. What I usually do is I put a bunch of pictures, look up some pictures of whatever I feel like drawing on Pinterest. And I advise you to use photographs of whatever it is you want to draw or draw from life, and limit yourself to 15-20 minutes of very quick gestural studies like we did during some of the warm-up sessions in class, keeping it very loose and having that continuous line approach, just to kind of get our creative juices flowing, get that monkey mind under control, and so that we don't overly fixate on the end result of the more serious study that we're about to do, just to kind of get ourselves in that zone. So keep it loose, keep a continuous line, just kind of searching around and drawing gesturally for just a few minutes. When we begin on a longer study, it's always a good idea to break it down into smaller bursts. So instead of trying to buckle down and do a 3-hour study for somebody who's new to it and doesn't know yet how to control the medium, such as charcoal. Even for me, it's a little bit tricky because I don't work with it every day, and it's not as comfortable as it once was when I was back in school. So instead of doing a longer study, just try to break it down to maybe an hour or 50-minute sessions with a short break. So if you need to complete this spoon and you think it's going to take you 3 hours to render, perhaps it's a good idea to do 50-minute, 10-minute break, 50-minute, 10-minute break. That way it's shorter sprints and it's not as overwhelming to think about when we're actually trying to do something that is demanding on our thinking, and something that is still new to us. So for this study, you can do half of your 18 by 24 page instead of going full size, since we have new challenges that have been presented to us with the transition to online study. We're now trying to minimize additional challenges as much as we can. So let's do half a page, and we're not going to render all the way to the edge. We're going to do a vignette style. Okay, guys, before I begin my demo, what I wanted to stress is that in half of your sheet, position it obviously the way you want to compose your own pictorial space with whatever object you choose. Don't go crazy. Something like a chrome or silver reflective cup like a glass would do. Any darker glass like a bottle of sorts will be a better choice. Obviously, I understand not everybody has wine bottles laying around at home, but if you have something else like a cup, I think a spoon would be probably the best thing to practice this on. What I wanted to mention is that we're gonna go not all the way in the page because we're only drawing this isolated object. Think of your composition as a vignette. If you're not familiar with the term vignette, essentially, let's say this is how you're gonna position your page vertically. Let's say you're gonna draw a bottle instead of a spoon. Don't go all the way to the edge. Leave quite a bit of space in the middle. You don't need to draw an actual border. Just focus on your object and position it somewhere in the middle of the page. You're gonna still draw the casted shadow and everything around it, but a vignette essentially is something that doesn't get trimmed like a photograph that extends all the way to the edge. It's just something that is focused only in the middle of the object, in the middle of the pictorial space, but it doesn't get all the way to the edge. So if we were drawing, another example right here, if we were drawing, in my case, it's going to be a spoon. Just to do a little quick thumbnail to illustrate what I'm talking about. Here's a little spoon, In fact, I'm actually drawing the spoon I'm about to draw as a demo. As you can see, it's not extended all the way to the edge, and I'm just gonna shadow or shade right around it in order to create enough contrast so the object begins to actually look three-dimensional. But I'm not gonna go ahead and draw my entire table, things around it, all the way to the edge as if it was a photograph that's literally just cut in the frame, right? Think of it as a camera. So something that is not a vignette is a photograph that we take with a camera and then we print it out. The camera has a physical border that it creates. That is not a vignette. A vignette is something that is kind of just suspended in our pictorial space. It could be, a vignette could be darkened on the edges, like a lot of those Instagram filters tend to do, or it can be white around your object. In this case, your object is going to be the main focal point, and you're going to darken your area around it, right, to indicate that it's actually three-dimensional, or at least to create that sense that it's three-dimensional in some space, but not render the entire space around it, if that makes any sense. And we're going to talk a little bit also throughout this exercise in the video about how does something like a very reflective spoon still how does it feel three-dimensional nonetheless. And we're going to also write about it in a short paragraph. It's going to be going to count towards your attendance for this particular exercise, since we are not actually meeting in class. And you can also see all those changes about how we're going to count attendance from now on in this course. That was something that we've discussed during our faculty meeting from now on towards the end of the semester, because attendance is still very important and your grade very much depends on it. So in order for us to count you as present whenever we're not doing live sessions, that is a way to go. We're going to do a discussion, possibly giving each other feedback and writing literally just a few sentences on a thread on the discussion board on Blackboard that will be related to the exercise that we're doing right now. So you're going to render around the object in the middle and leave all this breathing space around your sheet. This is actually slightly smaller than half of your drawing pad size. So as to make this video shorter and not make you guys fall asleep, but for you, use half of your drawing pad and position it horizontally or vertically up to your own discretion. Figure out how you want to compose your own work. Luckily, it's just one object, so we're not drawing 5 different spoons and bottles. It's just going to be one object, just to understand how we can use the value structure that we've learned up to this point to depict something a little bit more complex with the reflective surface. All right, so now that this is all out of the way, I'm just going to begin by blocking in my shape lightly, just like I said with the pencil. I'm holding it very loosely. I'm not holding it as if I'm writing something. I'm holding it again to overhand grip, to minimize my brain's tendency to overthink and wanting to cling to that sense of control, right? So I'm drawing from life. The spoon is in front of me, as you see in this little picture. So what I'm paying attention to right now is mostly the proportions. Obviously, if you need to measure it, if you're not trusting yourself as far as proportions, those are all very important. We want to make sure the spoon looks as a spoon and that the proportions of it are true to life. So all the previous things we've learned in this class up till this point still have to be applied. I'm blocking in pretty much the shape of it, maybe some edges. I'm not really worried about all the details in the handle. What I'm really trying to get down right now is how the shadow, where the shadow is casted, and how the light essentially behaves. And also what I'm looking at is the shapes that reflections form within the actual spoon. In my case, it's a spoon, so I'm kind of, you can squint or you can close one of your eyes. A lot of times it helps to break it down and try to block in with your pencil very lightly various shapes. Also make sure that you're drawing it with the same light conditions. I started doing it in the evening, and I realized that I have more time during the day to complete this demo. So I'm actually gonna try to do another one during the day. I do have a lot of light with this lamp that's right above me that is acting as my tripod at the same time right now, but I'm kind of squinting and closing one of my eyes to register some of the different values within that spoon. And it's definitely a highly reflective surface, so it does present extra challenges as opposed to something like a glass bottle or a mug or any glass object would have. But you are welcome to select something that's maybe not quite as highly reflective. Let's see, so I'm kind of blocking in some of the shapes that different values form. So essentially right now I'm just blocking in the shadow that's casted. It's a little bit tricky because I have different light sources. My main source of light is, like I said, the lamp, but also I have a lot of light that's diffused from the windows and a lot of ambient light in this house. So pretty much only spend like 3 minutes to block in the shapes that are formed by different values, different reflections, very loosely get the proportions right and position it, compose it within your page. With that done, spend about 3 to 5 minutes on this stage. Now we can go in with charcoal, and we're not worried so much about highlights, but you're welcome to leave the brightest highlights sort of empty. Don't block in those areas with a lot of the charcoal and the charcoal dust, but try to begin by simply laying some pigment down. Notice what are the darkest areas, what are the brightest areas. The good thing about charcoal is that because it's so malleable, as I mentioned earlier, it's very easy to make corrections as we go, even if we feel like the shape of it or the proportions or the size aren't quite accurate. So you can use your finger or you can use the paper stump for more finer blending. You don't have to blend throughout the entire composition. Just in certain areas where you want, where the value that you observe in your object is got a more gradual transition, right? So instead of doing it always with the finger, so you can also block it in, lay a lot more charcoal down like this with the edge, flat edge. but you don't have to blend everything uniformly. Blend certain areas and leave some other areas a little bit more textural. That way, there are points of interest and your work is not going to look like just one smudgy looking thing. So this little section I'm working on right now has a window reflection. So that is my brightest bright. So that is my, on the value scale, as you remember, 0 to 10, that is my 10. That is a little object that's reflected. In this case, it's the window. And comparatively speaking, there's no other highlights around it. So what is important here is that that is one of the things that will be on the short questionnaire in the discussion board, is that there's a high value contrast present in this type of object that's highly reflective. What does high value contrast mean? It means that a lot of times the gradation is not a very smooth gradation from one value to the next, although there will be some gradation, some areas of gradation, but the highly reflective surfaces tend to have abrupt transition edges through the values that are present. So to put it in simple language, between the darkest dark and the next value that's next to it, there's a high contrast, so there's no gradation. And the transition edge is abrupt, so it jumps from something very dark to something a lot brighter and vice versa very rapidly. Kind of like we did in those arbitrary values that we tried to establish in the previous study with the helmet. So I'm not too worried about getting it exactly right off the bat. I'm just trying to block in certain areas. So I'm not fixated so much on the details. I'm mostly observing, to the best of my ability, that dance of different values that we talked about in class, to mimic something that has an inherently highly reflective quality to its surface. I'm noticing those transition edges, again, very important. What's the brightest, and I'm trying to kind of leave the brighter areas intact. I'm not even worried about going too dark necessarily, because I can always go with an eraser at a later stage, and by tapping your needed eraser you can lift up some of that extra darkness of your surface. So right now just working mostly on blocking in, laying a lot of, I'm not even going to worry about the handle, the detail in the handle. I'm going to actually leave that towards the end, where I will go with an eraser and reveal some of those highlights that will mimic essentially the intricate detail that design work in the handle. All right, now I'm mostly focusing on the overall value within this space, and perhaps some of the darker areas within that reflection. Let me see if I have a softer charcoal. So it's reflecting something through here that's pretty dark through the tip of the handle. And even in this squiggly mess that is emerging, you kind of intuitively, our brains are already arguably establishing some kind of, I don't know what to call it, I guess an illusion of something that may possess a reflective quality to it, because we've been trained to look at a lot of objects that have that inherent quality to themselves, such as silver and chrome and glass and other things that we look at on a day-to-day basis. So because of that, it's easy to begin to see patterns emerging in this drawing for us to begin to recognize it as a reflective object. So what I want you to really pay attention to as you're working on it is those transition edges. Again, the sharpness of those transition edges is what indicates what will make it appear more highly reflective. But that does not mean that the only time you will notice a sharper transition edge is when it's a highly reflective object. I'm just saying within the surface of something as highly reflective as a spoon, perhaps you will notice more transition edges that are more abrupt, and there will be a sharp contrast between various values. There's going to be some darker area through here. You can also alternate the way you apply your medium. In this case, it's charcoal. You can apply it with a flat edge like I did in some areas to cover more ground quickly. You can also apply it with cross hatching or just hatching like we did with our pencil exercises. In fact, with charcoal, a lot of the details will come from reductionist method. What reductionist method is going back in with your eraser and lifting up that value, as we touched on with the previous study, instead of adding pigment to the surface as I'm doing right now. It's reducing the pigment, so removing essentially some of that extra pigment. I do want to point out to also the fact that try to eliminate extra sources of lighting and having too much different lighting bouncing off your reflective object, because it's going to be that much more difficult, and it's going to have that many more different reflective edges with sharp transition edges that you would have to really notice. So the less complex your lighting is in your environment, wherever you sit down to draw this, the easier it will be to observe what's going on. Unfortunately for me, I have a lot of different objects because I'm working in my kitchen, and all the curtains and picture frames and everything else is literally just reflected in all this surface right now, where it makes it that much more difficult. As you see, some of these areas I'm kind of doing more of a mark making approach, so I'm not worried too much about getting it right, quote unquote, right off the bat. So in some areas I like the smudgy look and kind of stretch it out to let the gradation go from dark to light very smoothly. In some areas I will perhaps create a bit of a more of a mark making approach to those gradations. This handle is very, very intricate, so let's see if I can lock this in. And again, just noticing what's dark and what's light, and how each of those transition edges look next to each other. Yet still more darkness right through here. As always, it's the relationship of values next to each other that give us that illusion. Nothing really appears as anything in the vacuum. It's only by comparison next to something else that it begins to look like a recognizable object. feel like there's going to be a bit more darker area through here. That's the window that's reflecting right now with the curtains on. Some like medium value through here, a little darker through here. Actually, this is all pretty much dark except for the edge of the spoon. I know you probably don't have the clipboards, the drawing boards with you right now, but you're welcome to use something like a flat surface, like a table, and it's probably a good idea to tape your paper down like I did here with your frog masking tape or whatever you got. Essentially the masking tape, the frog tape, has less adhesive quality to it, so it's not gonna rip off your paper when you remove it, but that will help you to keep it in place so it's not moving around under your hand. I'm gonna go back in there and try to maybe create a variation in how I apply the medium. So here I'm using more of a mark making, hatching, as we did a lot with the pencil work, instead of having everything smudgy. My challenge is that, again, there's a lot of different shadows casted from various light objects, but the beauty here is that you don't have to make it a photograph. You can just interpret the values that you see. So I'm interpreting that the background here still has some medium value, and I'm laying it down very lightly to create that vignette that I talked about. Instead of shading everything all the way to the edge, I'm just creating a vignette. So that's kind of where you can exercise a lot of creative freedom. The way that you would uniquely express yourself through the medium is gonna reveal itself right through this process. The way you handle the medium is gonna be uniquely yours in the way that you do marks and the way that you do mark making. Because if everybody was just making everything bland, everything smudgy, then it loses that uniqueness, and that loses that unique voice of yours in it, because everything then just begins to look like a hyper-realistic photograph. So I'm just continuing to lay down values, closing one of my eyes and really pausing to look at various details. And now I'm kind of approaching the time when I need to really begin to notice a little bit more details, instead of simply blocking in a variety of values. This guy is very soft and breaks easily, which is kind of an annoying factor, but at the same time, I like this softer, sketchy charcoals, because it takes almost no effort for me to create a mark. I can literally just drag this with minimal pressure, and there will still be some kind of mark left on the surface, and all it takes is just squiggling around. That's kind of like what I'm doing right now. Is I think the reflection of the curtain rod, or the shadow of the curtain underneath the rod, so it's a little darker. So I'm trying to kind of capture that transition edge, that abrupt transition edge I talked about. Blocking a little bit smoothly here because it's a curtain, it doesn't have that sharp sharpness to the details. Picture frame, I think, another picture frame. I'm gonna go ahead and lighten a little bit throughout this mid-tone that I blocked in earlier with the regular eraser. Do not when you begin to use eraser with your reductionist approach, lifting up some of the value, what happens if you try to kind of clean the shavings of the eraser off the surface with charcoal is that it's gonna essentially do something like that. It will muddy up your work. So be very mindful of not only not resting your hand on the surface where there's a lot of pigment already laid down, but also when you try to clean the shavings off, I would recommend using maybe like a cheap brush. It could be a synthetic brush like this or a Bristol brush. They actually have those larger brushes made out of horsehair. I don't know what the word for it is, but those are specifically made for cleaning up your eraser shavings. Otherwise, you're gonna just make everything muddy. So keep that in mind. I'm gonna actually now use a sharp edge of a regular eraser, a very soft but regular eraser, to lift up some of that value on the back, because I realized I kind of made it a little bit too dark. And you can see how easily I can make that area lighter. Even with the brush, you got to be careful because all the dust from the charcoal will be still smudged. Not as bad as you would do with your hand, but definitely easy to smudge it. So again, that darkest edge of the casted shadow is right under my object. I'm gonna tap a little bit with the eraser. You can use either one. You can use your kneaded eraser to get rid of some of that darker tone and just play with it. Just try to see how you can manipulate the value with different marks. Like I said, don't have to be always smudging everything with your paper stump or with your finger. Oh, by the way, for those who don't have paper stumps, something like a cotton swab would do the trick. It can be also used because it provides somewhat of a sharp corner, and if you can't make it too sharp, just go ahead and remove some of the extra cotton of that cotton swab, like so. Make it sharper again. That way it's not as wide. Basically make sure it's not a bunch of stuff hanging off of it. But now it's kind of reveals the plastic handle, but it does help definitely to make the gradual areas more smooth. I don't want this patchiness here, so like the stuff that I laid down accidentally with MOBA patchy quality, I'm gonna smoothen it out. Can see there's some marks within that window reflection and slightly darker here. And the beauty here is that the fact that you don't know the environment in which I am sitting right now, you still can begin to recognize it, like I said earlier, as a reflective object. Obviously, I'm kind of narrating what I'm drawing right now, but the fact of the matter is your brain still made sure that you can recognize this. as a spoon. So it's more of a layer by layer kind of approach. Especially with charcoal. I'm gonna actually now correct this a little bit. It's more of a so the key things to stress again that we need to learn here is that there's a high value contrast throughout different values within the value structure, which means there is no or there's minimal gradual transition between one value to the next. It kind of jumps from one to the next very quickly. And I'm guessing there's a little bit lighter here again. Not as light as the window, which is fine. You can, if you feel like you lift it up too much in comparison to those highlights, those are the whitest whites in your picture, you can pick up some of the dust and kind of block it in with more medium and push that value back down. Just a fun fact, some people actually draw with charcoal dust instead of charcoal, so they don't use a stick, they literally just dump a bunch of dust on the paper and they smudge it around, and then they do mostly reductionist method, lifting up the highlights from that messy dust, like so. You can use an eraser basically in this reductionist method as if you were using it as a pencil to create a mark. So instead of thinking of it as a correction tool to just lift up value or remove sort of mistakes or things you think aren't working well, you can literally create marks with the sharp edge of your regular eraser. Let's say I wanted to, I'm gonna block in, let's see, just to demonstrate what I'm talking about. I'm gonna block in a little bit more here to make that vignette a little bit more pronounced. You don't need to draw a lot of details in the background. I don't need you to draw like the edge of the surface, or mine is laid on a piece of paper right now. I'm just gonna give it a bit of a suggestion. But again, I'm not worried about getting it all the way to the edge, just to kind of give it a sense that it's laying on some type of surface. Okay, so back to what I was talking about with the eraser, with the reductionist method. You can go back in there with a sharp edge, and you can also create marks as if you did with a pencil, but now instead of creating a darker mark, it creates a lighter mark. And you take some of that pigment out of your paper. If you went a little bit overboard with the darkness, you can even cross hatch with that sharp corner of the eraser. So there's some light coming through behind the thin part of the handle of the spoon, which means that this is the casted shadow on the surface, and then light, and then goes back, for me, goes back to the darker edge here. The edge also has some ridges, not just the thick, thin variation, but also it kind of, there's a lot of complexity within the handle of this particular spoon, where the back is lighter, the thickness here begins to darken, and then again the cast shadow is darker, and then there's some gradation, some mid-tone-ish gradation, maybe not even that dark, which for now is fine. I'm just gonna lighten it up first by taking some of that extra charcoal off with the paper stump. You can do almost like a stippling approach, or you can take your kneaded eraser, make it sharp point to indicate some of the finer details. And I see there's a kind of a mid-tone-ish, like number 7 or 8 on the value scale, kind of a highlight, but a very subtle highlight through here. So actually I'm just gonna block this in with one value. I'm gonna try to even it out by creating a bit of a gradation, and then you can correct the sharpness of the edges also with your eraser quite easily. You see a lot of dust has been already picked up even with the brush, so I'm being very careful not to smudge my work. I'm gonna clean it off on the edge of the paper, and I'm gonna reinstate that subtle highlight right here. Again, like I said, I don't want this highlight specifically to be as bright as those window reflections. And as we learned before, the way to create the highlight, to make that highlight stand out, is to make sure that all the other lit up areas are much lower on the value scale. So in order for those windows to stand out, I have to squint my eyes and really analyze the entire composition and see what else can match that lightness. Nothing can, because that's pretty much pure white, 10 on the value scale. Everything else that's pretty light needs to be pushed down even more in order to for those highlights to stand out. So I'm gonna actually darken, create even more contrast for those windows to pop. Lay even more pigment down. And obviously I can't achieve pure black with charcoal. It has its own limitations, but charcoal does create quite a dark mark if you put a lot of it down. So you can in fact get it much darker than, or you can achieve darker values than you could with something like a pencil. So I got that little highlight reinstated there after I smudged it. There is another highlight that's running along the edge. Because it's very fine, I think I'm gonna try to use this guy. And just create a little suggestion of another highlight that I noticed that runs along the edge of this handle. Whenever in doubt, I'm just gonna kind of pause. And obviously, I'm not capable of making a photorealistic rendering of the spoon. I'm just kind of observing all the different values to the best of my ability. Again, not making a photograph of what I see. I'm making an interpretation to the best of my ability of what I see. So with that said, what is a good idea to do is to kind of disregard or let go of some of the finer details. Like I have a lot of different reflections that are going on, if I'm really careful, going on in this very thin edge of the actual spoon, the handle of the spoon, but I'm not gonna try to translate every single one of them. Some of them are gonna be unified with the adjacent values, with the edges of different values that are right next to it, instead of me trying to translate every single one of those little variations. First of all, it's more of a space constraint. I simply cannot get to that kind of microscopic level within this format, within this size. And second of all, it's not necessarily an objective to get every single tiny variation of values that we see. Again, it's an interpretation of what we see. If you feel like the edge is the sharp transition edge and it gets too fuzzy because of you working on it for a little bit too long, go in there with a sharper tool or sharper corner of your charcoal and get real close to that edge and kind of just darken that contrast between the transition edge. I realized that there is not much shadow hitting the surface casted here from the way I see it from my angle. So I'm gonna go back in there and create a little bit more of a transition edge, getting a little closer to the actual spoon handle right here. So it's just dark right underneath, and then the casted shadow travels towards the actual this part of the spoon. Which brings me to the next important point that you need to remember that will be on the questionnaire, which will again, just to remind you, act as our way to keep people accountable and to have the attendance taken. In order for me to know that you actually watched this video, you're going to be able to answer now with the points that I have mentioned throughout this demo. And this point is in regards to how can we still see it as a three-dimensional object? What gives a three-dimensional object essentially a three-dimensional sort of depth and appearance, even though it has a very highly reflective surface? And the answer to that question lies in terms of the formal value elements. And if you remember what we've covered in class in the very beginning of our value unit, is that the basic elements of how light travels, what I call the light logic. So in this case, what gives us a sense that this highly reflective object, in this case is a spoon, still feels three-dimensional, is because of all the light logic still occurring. So apart from having a lot of sharp transition edges within different values of the actual surface itself, the shadows that are casted from the light source give our brain enough information to construct an image essentially an illusion in our head that reads as three-dimensional because of the light conditions. So if we didn't have any shadow casted, if we didn't have a clear source of lighting, and that spoon was just suspended in space, it would not read as three-dimensional because there's no light. The light does not behave based on the common conceptions of how we recognize something three-dimensionally. So in this case, because we still see the cast shadow and some of the areas where the thickness is shown, that reveals the light logic, that's what gives us enough information to see it as a three-dimensional picture. There's another highlight for me that's right through here. It's very bright. Actually, several. I'm gonna keep adding more value through here. A bit of a smoother transition through here. A little darker right through here. So I'm exerting a little bit more pressure now on the tip of the charcoal. This charcoal stick, in fact, is hotter, which makes it slightly easier for me to lay down darker areas. As you can see, just adding a few of those marks already made the spoon look even more three-dimensional, give it a little bit more depth than it previously had. I kind of like some of the scratches on a metal that are evident right now in the highlight right here in the corner. So what I'm gonna do is, even though that highlight is by no means as bright as the windows that are reflecting in the middle of here, I do like those scratches on the metal, so I'm gonna see if I can get them get that translated somehow into my drawing. First, I'm gonna get a bit of a highlight right through here with my kneaded eraser, just to, and there's a lot of pigment in there already. I'm gonna cut some corners. And then I see some scratches, so how can I get those scratches in there? I'm just gonna just make a little bit of a impression with an eraser. Obviously, you don't need to worry about going as fine details as this with your work, but just adding a few finer details can really give your drawing even more life. So I do like how those scratches look. If I wasn't restricted to just charcoal, I would probably go in there with like white ink and very fine nib, but white, and just create a few marks with white, pure white right there in that little corner, just to kind of go against the darker charcoal that's already laid down. I'm gonna do another little mark here. To get that edge, that tiny thin edge of the spoon that's still reflecting on its own. too much. I don't want it to be too bright, so I'm just gonna push it down. But I did want a little bit of that texture within that section because that's where my curtains are. I'm trying to pay attention to what's darker, what's brighter, spoon or the background. So I noticed during this little examination that the background is also not pure white. So these are pure white. This is pure white. That highlight is very bright. Maybe there's another highlight right through here that's pretty bright. And pretty much that's it. Maybe a tiny one right through here, which I haven't even established yet. So I'm gonna go ahead and get it down there. And then in order for it to stand out, I'll just push down the adjacent value. And I'm struggling now to get it as bright as my windows. And the reason is I try not to get any charcoal dust on those little window reflections. As opposed to other areas that I decided that I'm gonna just not worry about right out of the gate. Okay, so I feel like that's a pretty good interpretation of my window. Okay, so I'm using the sharper edge now of my charcoal to go really close in there, get some of the finer details established. I'm gonna unify throughout here because I don't see too many different values throughout this part of the handle. So I don't want it to be jittery with a bunch of different marks. So I'm just gonna go with a passive flow cross hatching style, and that's good. Just a little suggestion that there's still some kind of detailing going on right through this bend. Don't want it too bright right there. Okay. So what makes an object like this spoon reflect different values back at us? So essentially what it's reflecting is its surroundings, right? The reason why we see all these different edges is because, well, first of all, the object's surface is bent. So unless it was a straight surface like a side of a cube or something that has a straight edge to it and not bent, it will reflect and distort the reflection, right? Like think of it as a fish, like looking at the wall through a fish bowl. The water will distort things that we see on the other side. So similar effect is happening here, but it's reflecting it in the bent surface. If this spoon was just a flat surface, it would act more of a closer to something like a mirror rather than distorting the shapes of all the objects that we have in our environment. And it will also reflect more of different values within that area if the environment is lit up. So right now I'm working during the day. A lot of those objects receiving a lot of light in my surroundings, which means that a lot of those different tiny details, tiny different transition edges will be evident in the surface of the spoon. So it does make it a little bit more challenging to see all the different details. And what I'm doing right now, I'm kind of just correcting myself. I feel like it was a little bit, proportionally a little bit wrong. And back to my point about making the highlights stand out, those values, the highest values within the composition that we're working on. In order for them to stand out, we need to notice what else can match that level of value, that highlight. And for me, nothing can really match that. Although I was kind of reluctant of darkening all around the spoon, I'm gonna have to lay down at least some darker tone all throughout here without going overboard. I don't want to darken it too much because the spoon has the darkest values within its reflective surface. But in order for these highlights to stand out, like I said, everything is a relationship. So here, the relationship is such that the surface on which my spoon is laying is, it's a piece of paper, but it doesn't have that whiteness to it. So in order for me to create the contrast that will make the highlights stand out, I do need to make sure that the background is appropriately shaded. So I'm just gonna, I don't want to go with a flat edge because the control will be, some of the areas will receive charcoal, some not, because the edge is not completely flat. So it's much easier, maybe not easier, but much more reasonable to go with lighter marks like this. And then if you want to smudge some areas, you can. If you want to leave some of the mark making, that creates also its own little interest, you can also do that. But since it's a vignette, I'm not going to shade all the way down. I just want to make sure that I shade enough right there around the spoon to push down the adjacent value, the value of the background. You may think of it that way. The spoon is casting kind of a longer shadow because I have some windows also on the left that are farther away from the object, meaning that the light travels at a lower angle, meaning that it casts a longer, a much more diffused, longer shadow right behind the spoon right here. But it's not very dark. The darkest casted shadow is right here underneath, and that occurs because of my lamp. Luckily, both lamp and the window through which almost direct sun is currently shining are almost aligned, so I don't have a lot of competing casted shadows here. What I'm doing with an electric eraser can also be done with a regular eraser, so do not despair. I'm gonna bring some of the lighter marks right close to that casted shadow. Maybe just a few mark making, just to kind of maybe make an impression of the fact that my paper surface also has some bends in it. So not trying to render it perfectly, but I do want to suggest that the surface on which the spoon is sitting has some kind of, at least visual interest, essentially, that it's not just flat, perfectly one tone, one value throughout the entire piece of paper, that it has some kind of variation, but you don't need to render the surroundings too accurately, just more of an interpretation, a suggestion that that surface has some kind of imperfections in it, right? And I've kind of exceeded my first 50 minutes already, so ideally take a short little break, go have a sip of water, make a tea, whatever you want to do, and then go back at it and do another 50-minute sprint. So right now, let's say I'm on my second sprint. I'm gonna shift my attention back to the handle now. Focus on the handle for a little bit more, just to get some of this detail, not so much looking like a mess of values, but get a little bit more detail in there. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna first go a little bit more uniformly. I already, throughout my initial stages, discovered what needs to be darkened, what areas really appear much darker than the rest of them. So I'm gonna keep that in mind, but I'm trying to push down the rest of the values so that when I go in with my eraser and I actually, instead of squinting, I'm closing one of my eyes right now so that my reflections aren't coming from two different angles, because just the fact that we have two eyes looking at something as bent of a surface as this will have all kinds of reflections in it. So one eye will have more reflections than the other and vice versa. So I'm squinting closing one eye just to kind of zero in on some of those reflections, and I see some in these details here. And this surface here is actually quite a bit lighter than the edge right here. So let me try to lift up some of this darker value. A little bit. Okay. And again, you can use the sharp edge of your eraser for the highlights, and just see how easily that charcoal gets lifted up, and then you can use more of a mark making reductionist approach. And I feel like I want a few finer little highlights to accentuate some of the more intricate detail in the handle. Unfortunately for me, there's a lot of it in there, but like I said earlier, just to reiterate, you don't need to draw all the details. Sometimes it's better to unify them. And a little bit through here, maybe a few more marks through here. So I'm not trying to photocopy that whole design, because that would be not impossible, but definitely a lot of work, and we don't need to worry about all the exact the way the leaves and the flowers are in the handle. So now that I've kind of lifted up some of the extra pigment, I'm gonna go back in with a sharper edge, another charcoal pencil, and go right there with the sharper transition edge. and just lightly make a suggestion of some of those details a little bit more, with a little bit more precision now than I could do with an eraser. So key thing to remember, like I said, that will be in the questionnaire is that transition edge has a high contrast value transition. I'm kind of trying to see maybe some of simpler geometric shapes that I could recognize throughout the different values reflected within the handle. So there's a little bit of a darker spot here, but then next to it, it's got a bit of a gradual mid-tone. So I'm gonna leave that darker spot there, leave the mid-tone, go back in with the area that has the most gradual transition and lock it in with my paper stump. And again, what happened right now is that it created a contrast between this visual element and this visual element. In this case, we have value at our discretion, so we focusing on the contrasts we create between different values. There's too much texture going on through here that creates too much jittery kind of visual effect, which I don't want. I'm gonna block this in a little darker than the background. Go back in, get a little bit of a highlight right there. All the way into this bend of the spoon. I'm not sure what exactly is going on right in this little detailing. Little ornament that's going on here, but I know that ornament also, all the bends in the ornament are reflecting light, so I'm just go in there and suggest that there are some highlights in that segment. But I'm really not too worried about making it exactly precise. I see that there's a lot of light coming through right underneath. Kind of phases out here a little bit, even through here. I do want to make sure that this edge is very sharp, since it contrasts with the background paper very nicely. So I'm just gonna go back in there with a sharper edge and get that line very sharp. You can remove some of the extra darkness, lift up some of the value, again with your paper stump or by tapping with your eraser. So I don't want it too crazy dark, so that the darkest darks stand out still. That's why I'm gonna lift up some of that charcoal dust with my eraser and gradually make some of the transitions a little bit more gradual without completely blending everything, right? So the main key things to remember is keeping those transition edges contrasty and very sharp. Actually, this guy needs to be pushed down because right now it's competing with my window reflections. Also, charcoal can be thought of as a lot more painterly type of medium, because you're moving stuff around and maneuvering around, manipulating that dust rather than mark making. So You can think of it that way if that helps to understand how you can best manipulate the medium for the desired effect. Okay, I kind of like this area. I even like how now by pushing everything down around some of the darker sections and adding some of the little details like that, those scratches on the surface of the metal now became more evident. And I'm not sure if you can see it on the camera, but they definitely became a little bit more noticeable. What I'm gonna do is push this down because it's traveling away from the window and the source of light, so it makes sense to have the background darker towards that edge of the paper because it's now farther away from the source of light, right? Since the source of light for me is located on the left. And pretty much close to the finishing touches here. Just gonna block this in a little bit more so it's not so much going on. Unify it a little bit. Unify some of the other areas that are competing with other edges. So if you see a lot of areas that have that textural quality to the actual medium, to the charcoal, and then there's a lot of detail in various transition edges that you're trying to preserve, you can go ahead and unify it, blend it a little bit more, because by sheer proximity they will compete with each other, and it will look like you won't know what you're looking at if there's too much noise, right? Think of it as just too much different jittery noise going on in that section, so it will confuse the eye, and you want to remove those sources of confusion from happening. So I'm gonna unify some reflection right through here. It's like some of those little flowers that are in the handle. Unify some of the reflections through here, even through here. So interpret it essentially. Don't just try to copy it. And go back in there with a little bit more mark making approach again, just to suggest a little bit more detail. Gonna go back in there closer to the edge. So again, it's that constant dance of different elements and different values. That the only way they work is by something that works with its neighbor, can really achieve that desired effect if it's by itself in a vacuum. It only works because there's another element of a different value that is positioned somewhere next to it. Actually, I'm gonna make another big highlight right here and another big highlight right here. And I don't even need to really accentuate what that detail is. It's just, I know that that part of the spoon is reflecting a lot of light back at me. So those areas are almost as bright as my windows. Push this down a little bit too, just to have that contrast. Well, in fact, probably what I'm seeing here are also the windows. They're just hard to read because there's a lot of little bands happening, a lot of things reflecting. The same things are reflected here are reflecting here, but there's a lot of variation in edges and bends of the surface. So by definition, all the tiny little bends of this material are reflecting essentially the entire room, the entire environment, that perhaps a little bit more readable throughout here. And that would be an enormous task to try and actually get everything down in that area. So I'm just gonna make an impression of it and interpret it to the best of my ability, but not hang up on all the details. Okay, and that's pretty much it. I kind of think that it's perhaps close to finish. I think that it's always important to remember not to overwork your piece, whatever it is you're working on, because there is such thing as working too long on your piece that will essentially dry the life out of it by going too far with details. And as we've discussed before, there's a certain beauty in just leaving things without describing them fully, and we'll sort of connect the dots in our brain, and the image will still read just fine. Okay, I'm gonna go back in there just to kind of suggest a few details with more of a sharper edge mark making. Squinting my eyes trying to see that edge underneath is receiving quite a bit of light from the window and my lamp, so I went back in there, lift up some of that value from it. Okay, but left the casted shadow right underneath, still quite dark, and indicate that sharp transition edge that we've talked about by doing that. Going back in right there underneath with a sharp edge of my charcoal pencil in this case, just to get even more of a sharper transition edge right there. Okay, so whether finished or not, I'm satisfied, and I hope you guys could see how we can manipulate charcoal in order to create different reflections within our object. If you have any questions, please post them on the thread under this assignment so we can have a discussion, and don't forget to answer those few questions in order for you to receive your participation and your attendance points for this part of our class.